All right.
Trustees behaving badly. Last month, the Yale Corporation, which is the governing board of Yale University, made a decision to eliminate trustee nominations by alumni petition. I'm talking today with Stanley Stillman, the publisher of Paideia Times and a Yale University alumnus, about the controversy around that decision and why higher education reformers should care about this issue. Thanks for chatting with me, Stanley.
You're very welcome.
Thanks. So before we can really understand why this is a controversy, we need to know how the process worked. The process of alumni getting on the board. How did this process work prior to this decision? And then how does it work now?
I think the best way to start is to understand the terms of the charter that Yale has, together with then the bylaws and regulations that govern how the corporation board meets. They're referred to as trustees, but it's a corporation in this context, in contrast to a trust. Leaving that aside, the charter was originally issued at a time when the state legislature in colonial times had to authorize the existence of a higher education institution in this case. There was no sort of standard corporation law which now enables one to set up a university or higher education institution. I have not examined that charter. I can imagine that it has been reissued. In any event, the chances are that it allows the original trustees to then establish the procedures by which they govern themselves. And as a consequence, the board consists of 19 individuals. There are 10 successor trustees who succeed themselves. The whole board, if you will, selects on the resignation of a successor trustee, or a retirement, whatever the reason, the whole board then selects, as I understand it, selects the successor trustee. It may be only the 10 successor trustees that actually select a successor. In addition, there are 6 alumni trustees, and I'll come to that, exactly how they are selected in a minute. Ex officio, so there's 16 trustees, and there is ex officio, the president of the university that the trustees have selected. And then, in addition, dating to colonial times, as ex officio, the governor of the state of New York and the lieutenant governor. In recent years, neither the governor nor the lieutenant governor, have exercised or been asked to participate. Nevertheless, they are ex officio members of a 19-member board. That board has enabled or provided for the election of 6 alumni of trustees from the alumni body, which in these days, given the graduate schools and so on and so forth, is I think north of 150,000, 130,000. It's really quite a significant number. The selection of those alumni trustees is assigned to a body known as the Yale Alumni Association, and its nominating committee then accepts candidates. Considerable number of candidates are then proposed, and that nominating committee then selects up to 5 candidates. In recent years, they have only nominated 2. And then there's a process by a election service company, which I think also performs services for business corporations.
Mhm.
At any rate, not exactly how it operates and who it provides services to, but the election services company then sets up the system, if you will, to send out the notice, if you will, of who the candidates are. And then when the voting process takes place, takes care of managing everyone's vote, and then submits a report to the board, the corporation board, that is, on the results. And that individual is then elected for a 6-year term. So over a period of 6 years, there are altogether six for a 6-year term, 6 alumni trustees. About 50 years ago, and I think in the late 20s, the board authorized petition candidates if they get enough signatures. In round numbers, about 4,500. If you get 45, one has to be a graduate of Yale under the circumstances, but given the provision, if you will, for a petition candidate, beginning about 50 years ago, one could qualify, if you will, to be a candidate that's included with the 2 or up to 5, if you will, that are selected for the alumni to vote on as an alumni trustee. That is the structure until just this year.
Right. Okay. And so this year, I think that's the next step. That's how it worked before. You get the 4,500 signatures, and then you can be considered.
Along with the ones that are already
Along
by
with
the
others,
nominating committee of the Alumni Association. Yes.
And so this year, just recently, the Yale Corporation made a decision to eliminate those petition candidates. And so now the only way to get on is through the official process of the Alumni Association. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. So they essentially eliminated
petition.
Okay. And what prompted that decision to eliminate the petition process?
Well, it's relatively rare, it turns out, but the petition candidate to be proposed in the first place. The last one who petitioned as an alumni trustee was a man by the name of Horowitz, and maybe 10 years ago, something like that. And under the circumstances, he ended up getting elected over and above the 2 or up to 5, if you will, that had been proposed by the Alumni Association. In recent years, since then, there's been an increasing concern about the nature of the Yale's policies with regard to its curriculum and administration, and very commonly referred to as these days and this year as having become very woke in its assumptions. So under the circumstances in 2018 and 2019, there were two attempts by candidates by petition, but neither one accumulated enough signatures. In 2020, a petition candidate by the name of Victor Ash ended up obtaining over 7,000 signatures and therefore qualified to be included along with the two that were nominated by the Alumni Association. That candidate, Victor Ash, in the alumni election process, if you will, goes on from about 3 months altogether, and concluded on May 23rd. Victor Ash, one of the other candidates, ended up getting elected by the alumni. In the meantime, the board, if you will, in its wisdom, decided that the process of petition candidates had become so polarizing, if you will, because of the views of the candidates and the voting process, the people behind them, and so on and so forth, which includes the Buckley program, which we'll get to again. So under the circumstances, at either a regular meeting, customarily the board meets every month, except in the summer and December, 9 months of the year. On May 18, a board meeting, either regular meeting or a special meeting, decided to change the regular bylaws and regulations that allows for a petition candidate. Ash, having not been elected to the board under the circumstances, all as a consequence of the Election Services Bureau services, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
The announcement was made, it happens on the 24th, immediately following the conclusion of the voting process.
Mm-hmm.
And under the circumstances, the president of the university called Victor Ash to explain that he had not been elected. And then subsequently, the senior trustee among the 10 successor trustees, there is a senior one, I assume the one that's with the longest tenure, who had been formerly president of Vassar College, announced the decision of the board not to permit any further petition candidates.
And I think we talked about this kind of off the air recently, that it just takes 50% to make that decision, right? You said it was just a simple majority to change the.
No, I believe it's 2/3.
It was okay. It was 2/3. Okay, I
understand it's a 2/3 vote is required in order to change.
So you mentioned just a moment ago that the Buckley program comes into this, and also that people were concerned that Victor Ash was campaigning. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, it was really a very active campaign. I as an alumnus, received, put it this way, Victor Ash, by his experience and background, turns out to have been a mayor for a good many years of Knoxville, Tennessee. And under the circumstances, he knows how to manage a campaign. So under the circumstances, together with the support, if you will, from the Buckley program, not only an experienced politician, if you will, and lining up signatures for purposes of a petition candidate, 7,200 he obtained. Under the circumstances, a lot more effort, put it this way, a lot more discipline and effort went into his campaign than the one in 2018 and 2019. Mm-hmm. I think that's the way to understand it. An experienced politician together with the Buckley program. It wasn't just the Buckley program. I think that Victor Ash because of his nature of his experience, knew what he was doing, and attracted a number of fellow alumni independently of the Buckley program to support his candidacy. Probably classmates.
I mean, it seems like normal alumni association processes are that they send you out, a photo, nice headshot,
They
and
do.
the person's
But
name and
there's
the class, and that's it, right? You don't get any other information.
That is true. That is true. But backing up for a minute, before that information is sent out to alumni to determine, for them to vote, if you will, there's a process of nominating or candidates to the nominating committee. And I once, as a member of I was not on the nominating committee when I was on the board of governors of the Alumni Association, but I knew about how it worked. And I've been asked over the years to nominate. I did not nominate Victor Ashe, but it's very clear that he could have been nominated. And under the circumstances, it does not appear that he attempted to be nominated and therefore was rejected by. I don't know that for a fact.
Okay.
He has not claimed that he was rejected or that he tried to be nominated and was rejected by the nominating committee.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, is probably a fact that ought to be, under the circumstances. It's sort of in the weeds. It goes without saying. File that is offered to the alumni on the person to be voted is strictly a curriculum vitae or a resume.
Yeah, there's not much.
It is not much. And in contrast, I know, for example, that the Board of Overseers at Harvard, for example, does include a statement on behalf of the individuals, if you will, which I understand, if you're correctly informed, and I agree, so I don't disagree with you, that the profile doesn't allow the candidate to say anything about what they would do were they elected.
Right. And I think that's pretty usual for alumni associations that you
I would say so. Yeah, I would say that
adequate information.
customary.
So the decision to eliminate this petition process, it seems pretty transparently designed to stamp out any candidates who are possibly going to be critical of Yale and its decision.
Take issue with.
How?
There's another way of putting it. Take issue with.
Right.
That's a more neutral way of putting criticism.
Mm-hmm. But what has the Yale Corporation said to defend or justify its decision? What's the official line they are taking?
Well,
I can't imagine, we don't like people saying bad things about us, and therefore we're going to stop them. They probably haven't said that.
No, it's a very neutral kind of, and I'll come to it in a minute, but let me say this about the Alumni Association, which is also true, as we've discussed in the governance working group, that those who get involved, and it's true in my own case, those who get involved in alumni activities and are willing to serve on there's a council, for example, that includes alumni of Yale, which in some senses serve like the Board of Overseers at Harvard. The Board of Overseers at Harvard, incidentally, just to compare the two, is strictly an alumni body, and until about 5 years ago, had no impact at all on the election of the members of the Harvard Corporation. The Harvard Corporation was composed of 6 individuals and a 7th ex officio, the president of the institution, self-perpetuating. Mm-hmm. Successor trustees in the same way as at Yale under the circumstances. But in the aftermath of Summers' presidency at Harvard, there's been a very, very significant revamp of the Harvard process now, where the Board of Overseers also has a way to propose a candidate or two to the Harvard Corporation, and the number of the members of the Harvard Corporation has been increased to 15 gradually. I think it may have now reached ultimately 15 individuals. Yale has not gone through any of that. Already had 6 alumni, already had a process under the circumstances. But what am I ultimately driving at? The people who get involved in alumni activities really are as interested, if not more interested, in basking in the glow of the institution and associations with its faculty and its administration, then they have real views about education, higher
Right.
education.
Right. No, they're normally boosters. I think that's pretty standard.
Yeah, I know. Well, you use that word, and that is a good word to use, no question about it. Some people, of course, that goes to the point of, the football team and the football stadium and so on and so forth. That goes without saying. So the Alumni Association, which was originally set up by the alumni and had its own organization, its own bylaws, its own charter, has ultimately been folded into the university, as has the Alumni Fund. The Alumni Fund, which dates back to the 1890s, I believe as early as that, was founded by alumni, and the Alumni magazine too. And they're boosters and so on and so forth. Yes, they believe in the education. But over the years, the university has expanded its, primarily by providing the funds to pay for the Alumni magazine. So the Alumni magazine is now issued by the university. It has a board, but it perpetuates itself. The Alumni Fund, same thing.
Yeah.
And now the Yale Alumni Association is combined with the Alumni Fund.
Okay. So
All
it's
one
not
thing.
independent in any real.
Not in any real sense.
Okay.
But even if they were independent, the kind of people who get involved are more of them are there to bask, as I put it, in the glow of the institution and its reputation. It's just one more chalk, if you will, on their resume.
Right. No,
So
I
then
see
moving on,
that.
yeah. Then moving on to the question you were asking, remind me.
Oh, yeah. What was Yale's official line about why they made
What
this?
was the official line?
Yeah.
Well, the senior trustee, Catherine Bond Hill, who has a PhD from Yale, she happens to be the senior trustee, and therefore issued this statement, if you will, that was sent to alumni. So I'll read part of it.
Okay.
I write on behalf and so on and so forth to inform you of a change to the process for electing alumni fellows to the board after careful consideration, so on and so forth, has determined that the petition process to become a candidate no longer serves the best interests of the university, and has voted to amend its miscellaneous regulations to remove that path to candidacy, and so on. The critical language here, the petition process has been seldom and intermittently used since its introduction in 1929, but in recent years, it has been embraced by issues-based candidacies with intense campaigning by petitioners who are materially supported by organizations, in this context, the Buckley Program, that seek to advance specific platforms. Of course, the specific platforms turn out to be the curriculum and the woke administration.
Right.
I mean, the millions of dollars, I think it's $50 million that Salave set aside in the recent 2 or 3 years ago, for example, for expanding the diversifying the faculty and administration and so on and so forth. All of it, of course, went toward expanding the administration rather than
Of course.
rather than the curriculum and the teaching process. You know, this whole administrative bloat that has occurred as a consequence of these issues. And I think the best way of putting it is, you know, diversity. And Lord sakes, there was a lot of diversity in my time. Holy smokes. But there's ever so much more now. And then you sort of have to scratch your head and say, well, what is a university but universal? Oh. And so the university now defines diversity as the planet rather than the United States or the nation state in which it's located. I mean, by definition, it's universal. It's a university under the circumstances. But that gets out of hand because then you lose all sense of community and identity. Oh, I see. Identity politics. Oh, yes. You get my meaning.
Right. So Yale,
Well, I think it's completely out of hand.
Yale got woke or became woke, and they politicized their curriculum, everything they were doing. And then they turn around and say that it's the petition candidates with advocating for issues who are politicizing things.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what it sounds like.
Campaigning by petitioners who are materially supported by organizations that seek to advance specific platforms.
Yeah.
Holy smokes. At any rate, were this trend to continue, it is not hard to imagine a new normal in which every election saw vying groups with organized support competing to focus Yale on their chosen goals instead of the goals chosen by the corporation board, the insiders, if you will.
Heaven forbid that Yale, the decisions of the corporation become substantive and focus on what the direction really should be. And it sounds like they're stamping out an important debate.
Yeah, no question about it. And of course, one of the characteristics of today's governance, if you will, is defined as shared governance with the faculty. And one then has to ask, well, you know, who is really in charge ultimately? And there isn't any question under the circumstances that the board itself bears that responsibility rather than the faculty. But this is a very significant debate that is currently engaging all higher education. And, you know, one of the final questions you have, why is this important? And under the circumstances, what we're witnessing here is a real debate about what is the purpose of higher education? What is the purpose of higher education? And yes, it's important I would suggest, in the purpose of higher education to recognize the virtue of diversity. But you can get so carried away with diversity, you lose all sense of the other purposes of higher education. Anyway, that's
right.
Now expressing my own views.
Well, let's go back to something you said earlier. You mentioned very briefly the governor and the lieutenant governor.
Yes.
But in reading about this issue, I've seen that there have been some problems there with transparency. And so, tell me what's happened with that.
There's no question that it is an issue that Victor Ashe and others have raised and made an issue of it. But I'm now saying, giving the benefit of the doubt, if you will, to the corporation board in this particular case, on this particular matter.
Okay, well, in that case, let's talk about a different transparency issue. And I mean,
Yale's
a private institution. It doesn't have the same rules as a public institution, but I just found out that the Yale Corporation embargoes its meeting minutes for 50 years, which seems just really excessive. What is going on with that? And are there any other corporation practices that you think are, unusual?
Well, I'm going to put my hat on as a lawyer in this context with experience that I have on this subject. And it's of course, um, very common with public institutions to be governed by public legislation and doctrines, if you will, of um, what's it called? FIO?
Freedom of information. Freedom
Freedom
of
of information.
information. Yeah.
Yeah, and so on and so forth. And then the political process needs to come forth with that kind of information.
Right.
And that has become standard practice
Mhm.
at all levels of government. But Yale, in this context, is a private institution with its customary practices, is employing a rule, if you will, in other words, very, very common in a state law. For example, authors or a public figure very, very commonly will embargo. I mean, say Kissinger and his private papers. I don't know, where he's giving those papers, one of the circumstances. But there would be an embargo on those opening those papers for examination by scholars for very customary 50-year period. So it's a meanwhile, you can have your freedom of information, so on and so forth, as far as a political corporation is concerned, the state of Connecticut, the United States, arguing that they are corporations also, which I think I will argue they are. So under the circumstances, it's a private, and it doesn't allow for freedom of information, and it has embargoed.
Right. So what if there is an alumnus who is really concerned that there's been fraud or shenanigans going on at the board level?
And
What-
there have been allegations.
Right.
There
What is
have been
the
allegations,
recourse?
no
What is
question.
the recourse? Do you have to wait 50 years? I mean, in all probability, if someone's concerned, they're going to be dead in 50 years.
I would say very, very challenging. To be rooted in corporation law. And you're looking at corporation law that goes back to colonial times rather than, and how it's revised as a consequence, because of contemporary legal doctrines. And it's not a business corporation either. It's an education corporation. So it's, hey.
Untouchable.
Well, arguably, yeah, no. And so that's why there's so much concern these days and why our country is so polarized, our nation state. The politics and the culture of our nation state is so polarized because the people are just really upset.
Yeah.
Half the nation or better voted for a certain figure that has a lot of color.
That's for sure.
And there are plenty of people, even who voted for him, who don't admire him.
Mm-hmm.
I'm getting into politics now, but there is no question about how the animus that exists in the public, and they're trying to do something about it. And meanwhile, the faculty, with their tenure and their freedom of speech and all the other ways in which they protect themselves, are, they're like the I joke with people and say, where is Henry VIII when we need him? The dissolution of the monasteries. Do you know?
Yeah. No, I get it. And it's a good segue, to my final question. Yale is an elite institution. Most people didn't go to Yale. Most people who went to college at all didn't go to an elite institution. They probably went to a state university, community college.
Yeah, kidding.
So, why should we care what Yale is up to? If it is this very remote institution for most of us?
Well, you sort of have to ask if there is a concept and how should we say it, a justification for elites of one kind or another. And there isn't a civilization that hasn't had an elite of some sort, particularly in its formative stage, entrepreneurial phase, as I choose to call it. And we had a very entrepreneurial community who founded this country, and no question about it. And we're living with that legacy now, and it's eroding under the circumstances. And what do we do with elite institutions which have, how should we say it, have gone off track and not paying attention to the needs of their society?
But can other institutions kind of learn from governance practices, or maybe what not to do from this episode?
Well, let me just say this: Yale is almost unique, if not unique, in having so many alumni represented on its board of trustees. When you stop and think about these public institutions, for example, there are university systems in the various states which allow for the citizens, if you will, to elect the board of trustees. Colorado, we've talked about that.
Right.
And you, as an authority on North Carolina, who picks the trustees or the governing board, if you will, for all of
the legislature, and there's no requirement that they be alumni of the institutions that they're serving.
On the other hand, there are certain institutions. I can tell you that Darden, for example, which has its own independent endowment and its revenues from tuition and so on and so forth, does not take a penny from the University of Virginia. It's completely independent.
Yeah.
So the president and of course, alumni are very, very prominent. And the medical school has a very, very prominent body, if you will, that's raised money for the medical school. Under the circumstances, the dean of Darden, the business school at Virginia, can say, oh, yeah, thanks, but I'm going to do it my way. Oh, alumni. So this is really one of the fundamental issues about higher education these days, about these fiefdoms that exist, particularly in the graduate schools. And the same thing is true at Harvard Business School, for example. Now, getting back to alumni, if you will, the process of having an alumni association that then, and we talked about this in connection, very relevant in this context are the three institutions, independent institutions. You mentioned 36 total in North Carolina, and the three that have the most prominence, if you will, Duke, Davidson, and Wake Forest. And you weren't able, correct me, to find out if Wake Forest had any provision for alumni.
No, I couldn't even find Wake Forest bylaws, so I have no idea how to get on the board there.
What you're looking for is ultimately the charter, because the charter then, in recent years, ever since corporations, a standard corporation law was established by states that dates back to the early 19th century, when it used to be that if you were going to form an organization in perpetuity, if you will, a corporation such as Yale or Harvard, you had to go to the governor and the state legislature to create it and draft and give you a charter.
Well, the other institutions, Duke and Davidson, as we talked about before, I went online. I was able to find the bylaws for the boards of trustees, and this is the election process. They lay it right out. Neither of them have a petition process like Yale.
Or how about alumni?
Alumni are on the board at Davidson.
Well, we talked about that just yesterday.
Yes. Yeah. But it's, as you said, it's part of the booster club. So,
but not at Duke. There's no alumni on Duke that you could tell?
Not that I could tell. I mean, I didn't go through the list of all the people. They're very well, maybe a very large alumni contingent, but yes. As far as I know, they aren't coming directly from the Alumni Association. I'd have to look again. But yeah, well, you're right. Yale is unique. Its petition process was unique.
Exactly. And the petition process, it turns out, dates to 1929, if you will. I said 50 years.
Longer.
Yeah, but under the circumstances, and why in 1929, I have no idea. Nevertheless, the petition process is it may be that the Alumni Association at that time, well, who knows what the evolution, when did, put it this way, when the charter granted to Yale by the Connecticut state, if you will, in colonial times, didn't have any alumni, please.
Right. It's brand new.
So there's no provision in the charter
Of course.
was granted by the state of Connecticut to the corporation known as Yale to provide for alumni. So somewhere along the line, probably because of the incredible energy, if you will, of Yale alumni, to create the Yale Alumni Fund.
Mm-hmm.
And it may be, when we're, and enough said on the subject. But what was eliminated the other day is this petition process.
Right.
There still are 6 alumni, and there is a process through the Alumni Association to nominate every year a new alumnus too.
Well, thank you, Stanley, for walking us through a really complicated issue. Before we go, I'm going to give you a chance to promote Paideia Times. So tell our viewers what it is and how they can get to it.
Well, it's I refer to it as an online, a quarterly, 4 times a year, online news digest, which draws on a very wide range of sources. A typical issue, we will process as many as 750 different news clip reports on higher education. And then from that 750, boil it down to around 250 to 300 per issue. And from those 300 per issue, edit 30 stories, which are then divided into, first of all, a section, 4 sections: purpose, governance, public trust, and external orders. And then within each, subjects, trusteeship and governance, administration, and so on. Well, you know.
Yeah, I find it very helpful. So I want our viewers to know about it
So
as well.
it's a very different type of news organization in this context than the news organizations at National Public Radio or the Washington Post, which are very much driven by individual journalists, reporters who in themselves are constantly reading from all kinds of sources in order to understand what to cover and so on and so forth. And of course, they all have sources one way or another. But from this context, we are focused on what's new from across the spectrum of the political, cultural polarization. And we hope that the intended audience, of the only audience that we have in mind, are trustees, 23,000.
And tell us the website where trustees can find that.
Paideia, PaideiaTimes.org, and I'll spell it. P as in Paul, AIDIA. It's the Roman alphabet spelling of the Greek word for education of the citizen.
Excellent. The true service, Stanley. Thank you. And thank you for talking with me today, and have a great afternoon.
Well, you too, will you?
Absolutely.